Thank you for joining IAB There.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to IAB There. I'm Brad Behrens, IAB's editor-in-chief. IAB There is our regular streaming show where we connect the digital advertising industry. This year, 2021, marks the 25th anniversary of the IAB, and we are thrilled to have an intermittent series of interviews about the founding and history of the IAB. My co-host for this series, who we will welcome in just a moment, is Rich Lafergie. He was the founding chair of the IAB. Many of you saw the episode about 3 weeks ago where I interviewed him. Today, Rich is also the director of the Forays Institute of Advanced Advertising Studies. Today, we're also going to welcome Wenda Harris-Millard. She is the MediaLink vice chair, and she was the vice chair of the IAB in 2007, and then chair in 2008. We're leaping forward from the founding of the IAB in 96 to 2007, 2008. And why are we doing that? Because the economic times today with the coronavirus, the impact on the economy, the inflection point that the industry is facing, strangely and I think powerfully echoes what was happening in 2007 and 2008. So let's bring them into the stream. Welcome, Wenda Millard. Welcome, Rich Lafergie.
Thank you so much, Brad. And hi, Rich. It's great to be here and really looking forward to this conversation.
Rich, you're muted, but we'll take it.
Thanks, Wenda. You bring so much history to the industry and the organization. It's great to have you here.
So Wenda, let's talk with you about you, which is tell us about your history with the industry and your pre-digital experience. Like, what were you doing as the internet came alive and as the commercially advertising supported internet came around, and why did you make the leap?
Yeah, so I spent 20 years in magazine publishing before I made that leap. And I think the reason that I wanted to participate in this new digital world was that at the dawn of that decade, the early 1990s, this notion of accountability started to creep into the conversation among marketers and advertising executives. And, you know, that very, very old by now joke, I know which half of my advertising, I know my advertising works, I just don't know which half. People used to laugh at that. By the 1990s, people stopped laughing and they wanted an answer. And I felt that this digital technology had the potential to provide the kind of answers that marketers were seeking. And so in 1996, I joined DoubleClick, I think as number 12. Kevin Ryan and I still argue who was 12 and who was 13. But for this broadcast today, I'll say I was number 12.
And then from there, you went on to, let's see, I think it was Ziff Davis. And then when...
Yep, Ziff Davis, and then Yahoo in 2001.
And that's when I met you, when you were the chief sales officer for Yahoo. This was, I think, around 2004, 2005. So let's zero in on when you first became vice chair of the IAB, leading into being the chair, because there were a lot of other things happening in your life at that moment, around about 2007. You were moving from Yahoo and going on to be the co-CEO of Martha Stewart Living Omnimedia, and we also had a global financial collapse. So talk with me about what was kind of going on for you in your life, both professionally and sort of like what you were seeing at the time.
Yeah, so I think at the beginning of the revolution, very beginning of technology and digital entering the world of advertising, marketers were asking why. They were actually kind of whining. Why do I need to do this? And so we spent many years answering that question, why? And then one day, probably 5-6 years in, that question turned to, okay, well, how? And then we spent those next years helping marketers understand how to best leverage new technology and this new channel. And around 2006, 2007, I think the question changed to, but how do I put it all together? You know, I get the why, I get the how, but how do I integrate digital marketing into all of my other channels to create an intelligent marketing plan? And so that's when I decided, after 7 years at Yahoo, 7 really fantastic years, that I wanted to put my background and all my learning together to answer that question, or try to. And so Martha, I was on the board of Martha, so I was very familiar with the company and the brand. But the reason that I found the opportunity to answer that question at Martha Stewart is that she had users, listeners, viewers, readers, and shoppers. And so in an attempt to figure out what does intelligent integrated marketing look like, that's the primary reason that I went over to run Martha. And so that was what was sort of going through my mind then. How do we put this all together?
And let's take a quick sidebar. Tell us about what you're doing today, because after a few years at Martha Stewart, you moved over and were working with our mutual friend Michael Casson at MediaLink, and you're still the vice chair there. But
Right.
sort of how do you occupy yourself professionally these days?
Sure. So I spent 12 or 13 years as Michael's partner at MediaLink, and we grew that pretty significantly over those years. And 4 years ago, we sold the company to a London-based firm called Essential. I moved over to London to launch MediaLink in Europe. And then last March, my contract was up, and I did not renew it, but I did agree to stay on as a consultant. So I do some consulting for MediaLink. But mostly I spend my time on boards, publicly held, I think 4 emerging technology and 2 not-for-profit. So I'm pretty busy putting all those years of learning to work to help some other companies thrive.
So, Rich, I'm going to turn to you in just a minute, but let me just sort of set the scene. Thank you, Wenda. I'm so pleased to have both of you here. We just last week released the PwC annual spend numbers, and this is something that, as Rich and I discussed in our last episode about the 25-year anniversary, was key to the founding of the IAB. In 1997, the numbers were 900. I went through this last night. Went through the report. $907 million. In 2007, 10 years later, it was $21.2 billion, which was a 26% year-over-year growth from the preceding year. In 2008, and this is when this is the era we're really zooming in on, it was $23.5 billion, which is still 11% year-over-year growth, but less than 26% because, of course, we had the global financial collapse. For context, in the numbers we released last year, it's $140 million, which is 12% year-over-year growth. Again, a different level of growth in part because of the pandemic. And for those of you who want to see the report, you can find it at IAB.com. Wenda, here you come in 2007. You're the vice chair. Jim Spanfeller, another person the three of us all know well, was the chair. And then in 2008, you became the chair, and then a year later, David Moore became the chair. So, Rich, let's turn it to you for a moment, which is like, what were you seeing, as the person who's been part of the IB since its inception at that moment, and how do you have any reflections on what Wenda was just talking about, which is, and by the way, I think a very Wenda decision, which is to add the word intelligent before integrated marketing, leaving us to infer that so much of the integrated marketing at the time was perhaps not so intelligent. But Rich, here comes Wenda, who's been working to put it all together at Martha, leaving Yahoo. What was happening from your perspective? And you're muted, sir.
At that point in time, we were very cognizant of the downturn in the financial markets, and we knew that online advertising had been accepted, but we just thought it was really just a kind of a pause in the growth versus back in the dot-com bubble burst, when we really had a crisis of conscience where people weren't necessarily accepting online advertising because they were assigning the value of online advertising based on the stock price of AOL and other companies. And when that bubble burst, all the marketers and advertising agency people who had been paying attention to online suddenly said, I'm not so sure. You see, I always thought it was kind of not real. So we had a real crisis back then. In 2008, it was a very different sort of scenario because, as Wenda said, we had already integrated ourselves into the marketing mix. And it was just a question of what is the right mix, and then how do you operationalize that? So agencies had their own digital hot houses for interactive, and they needed to get integrated into the overall holding company and become much more of the process. So it was really just more, let's get through this period in 2008, and it wasn't the crisis that we had with the dot-com boom.
So then connecting the dots for me, let's go to what I think this is before we started calling it the annual leadership meeting, but the annual conference of the IAB in 2008. And Wenda, in one of your more quotable moments, of which there are many, you said, actually, let me tee it up and then ask Rich for what the response in the audience and the industry was. You said, we must not trade our advertising inventory like pork bellies. And this made the New York Times, among other places. So what was the response in the room, Rich? And then Wenda, I'm curious about how you look back on that.
There was a gasp in the room because Wenda was saying what everybody was thinking, because there was this movement with ad exchanges that were selling the notion that inventory prices were going to go up. We were going to make more money if we only started to use ad exchanges. And on the publishing side, it was hard to understand how that was going to work and how the industry wasn't going to get commoditized. So it was the quote heard round the world in our industry. And it was still early with ad exchanges. It was still early with programmatic. We weren't really sure how it was all going to work out. The world has changed dramatically. And I think that was just a moment in time where we were still coming to grips with how that was all going to play out.
And it was, I think, unusual for someone serving as the chair of the Interactive Advertising Bureau to be the person who made that statement. Is that a fair?
Yeah, it's absolutely fair. I think it was one of the more forceful industry statements coming from a chair prior, or maybe since. It was really a clarion call for people to come together, and I think it was definitely took the industry by surprise, and it was a mobilizing force.
And Wenda, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but we have this sort of arc of from ad networks to ad exchanges and trading desks to programmatic, where context has become increasingly divorced from advertising. And I think that's one of the things that statement about pork bellies was saying, although there are many technologists these days who will argue quite strenuously to the contrary. But I guess my question to you, Wenda, is looking back, do you still agree with yourself? Do you think you were right? And sort of look forward also, like how are things progressed since then?
I think like many Clarion calls, and by the way, that's exactly what it was intended to be. It was a heads up to the industry that we had people spending millions and millions and millions of dollars to produce quality content, and users or viewers of that content specifically chose it because they related to it, they enjoyed it, liked it. Not everybody views the same material, so the user was selecting that content that companies had poured millions of dollars in. And the rush to what we now call programmatic, seemed to ignore the impact of content on advertising. And that's something that traditional media has always understood, that context matters. I mean, think about the difference between the New Yorker and the Economist and the Atlantic, and some homegrown content that really lacks quality, lacks authenticity, authority, fact. There's a big difference between how a consumer feels about advertising in different environments. And so this clarion call that I made was to get the industry to acknowledge that if we just kind of gave it away, it was completely automated, we were going to crash pricing. And we were really going to hurt the industry and hurt all of the publishers who pour, as I said, millions of dollars into producing quality content. And so that was exactly what it was intended to be, Brad. It was a clarion call, and it was a slow down here. Let's think about this. In retrospect, was I right? Do I agree with myself all those years ago? Yes, I absolutely do. I think, like many issues, you go way to the right or way to the left until you come back to center. And I think I had to make a very strong point in order to get us to all think about it and then come back to center. Do I think programmatic advertising is important? Absolutely. And that wasn't at all what I was saying. I kind of was saying, slow down, let's understand the implications, and let's move forward with full thought and full consideration. So I don't disagree with myself. I think I think I would do it again today. I would say it again today.
Rich, you're nodding vigorously. I think you might have something to say.
Yeah, and I think we've come full circle in, as Wenda said, with the pendulum swinging back to center. You know, as we are looking at the loss of the cookie and the identifier and addressability, context and content has become more important. So I think we're just coming back to center. And, you know, I think the risk back then was that we would get swept away by technologists and technology. And I think, you know, we have a rich history with the IAB of the value of content and the value of publishers, as well as embracing technology. I mean, we're a big tent as an organization, and we have ad technology companies, we've got publishers, we've got platforms. We're a big, big tent, and there's a place for all of it. And I think it's all, again, come back to center where there's technology, there's content, there's quality.
You know, I just want to observe there's an optimistic quality in this conversation that that we can push the pendulum and that it will swing back to the center. Whereas in so much of the rest of our discourse, you know, as a civilization right now, we're just seeing increasing polarization and a lack of coming back to the center. And so it's a lovely thought to think that our industry is possibly going to you know, be a place where we can meet in the middle. On the notion that you never want to waste a perfectly good crisis, I just want to sort of zoom in on one thing, which is the clarion call that we're talking about, and then we're going to go on to another one. To what extent do you think that it was connected to the financial crisis, that this is the moment, or this was the moment in 2008 where we should be rethinking these things because of the economic pressure? This is to you, Wenda, although Rich, I'm curious about your response as well.
Sure, it was definitely a factor. There's no question at all. The uncertain financial times, you know, certainly from those emerged a lot of questions about our industry and its health. And I think that, you know, my notion that this could crash prices and commoditize our industry, that was definitely, you know, connected to the crisis. That being said, my guess is I would still have made that speech even in a healthy environment, because in a healthy environment you're less likely, obviously, to worry about things. Things are looking so good. So yes, I'm sure that had something to do with it. But I think even in a healthier economic environment, I would have put out that red flag.
Yeah, I think the timing of that was really driven a lot by the new technology platforms. Google Ad Exchange came out right around that time.
Right.
And frankly, a lot of people in our industry did not see it coming. And I think that's what it was so important that Wenda gave everybody a heads up that this was something to pay attention to.
And I think we are looking at a similar moment right now. Let's scoot ahead 1 year to another annual conference in 2009. And again, Wenda, you were the chair at the time, and you argued, and I'm going to do two quotes here. One is, you said, while it is undeniable that technology is more important to advertisers and data can give us keen insights into consumer behavior, an overemphasis on measurement is holding back the business. And then the final line of that talk, and we'll go to Rich first about the response in the room and your response individually. The final line was, stop acting like we're selling schmadas and more like the makers of magic that we are, makers of magic. And as a grandson of a long line of schmada men, I really appreciate that one. Rich, response, because again, this is a provocative statement and an exciting one, and one I think that is particularly poignant at this historic moment. But Rich, what was happening back in 2009?
Well, I think the reaction in the room was one of inspiration, where people were reminded of why we are in this business in order to help consumers and to help advertisers. There's always been this push-pull in the industry with the technologists and then the media people, and this was a way for things to come together in the way that Wenda was framing it. You know, we talk about just because it can be measured doesn't mean it should be measured. And that's been one of our overhangs in this industry from the day one, you know, from the click-through rate, you know, versus, you know, focusing on conversions in those early days. So I think there was a real grounding and reminder that this is why we're in the business, and it's not just about technology. And, you know, but we can't get away from the discussion on technology as we are dealing with attribution, addressability, all those different issues, which are still dogging us. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of that stuff that Wenda was talking about back then is just as applicable now.
Wenda, has anything changed? And has your opinion changed?
My opinion has not changed. Because of my traditional background in magazine publishing, I had grown up in a world where art reigned because we had no way to measure. You know, if somebody said to me, gee, you know, how many bottles of Bufferin, you know, did that ad sell when I ran it in Family Circle? I'd be like, I don't know. How would I know? And, you know, there was just much more trust that art drove the business. And then I think at the beginning of the digital revolution, you know, I felt like for, I don't know, 15 years, I was sitting in a math, science, and technology class screaming, but wait. And, you know, again, I think it's another example of coming back to center. You know, at first it's all art and magic. And then over here, it's all science and technology. And then we realize, wait a minute, this is an and world we're living in. We don't have to choose. And that's the beauty of the technology, that it has brought more accountability. But I think if you try to quantify everything, you'll get really confused when you go to a museum. You know, how do you quantify, you know, the Van Gogh? And so we are part art and part science. And if we acknowledge that, then we can advance the industry. But the fact that we were stuck in that math class, that was what I meant by it's holding us back. And it wasn't a time, by the way, when we were particularly creative with content. And that was a lot of my focus at Yahoo, was helping the creative community understand the opportunities in digital. But that conversation was pretty drowned out for a long time. But if you look now at the quality of the content, the quality of the creativity, not all of it can, or as Rich said, should be measured. Art can live beautifully with science, and that's when we have a very, very healthy industry.
Well, as both of you, I think, know, I started my career as a Shakespearean, so you're never going to get an argument from me against the value of aesthetics in human life. But I'd also like to point out that we do live our lives sometimes when we're not looking at screens, although during coronavirus less and less. And so what the ad tech sort of complex can capture is only a slice of human behavior. And those times when you're walking down the street and seeing an ad in the distance and no one notices, those still are impressions. There was a CMO who was very humble in one of my earliest kind of industry events, who said simply, all we can say is that such and such campaign was associated with a period of growth, right? And that was it. They were unwilling to make the kind of direct attributions that we struggle to make, and that we're capable of making, just not as completely, I think, as we sometimes think. So let's look forward, which is, we've been talking about this a lot, but we are at the 25-year point. Wenda, let's start with, how do you think that the IAB has changed since 2007, 2008, 2009? And then let's compare and contrast what's going on right now, the crisis that we don't want to waste with coronavirus, with what was happening back then, and kind of look forward, like, what should we be doing? So that's to you first, and then to Rich, please.
Sure. Well, I think like all good and positive things, the IAB has matured beautifully. I would say one of the most significant differences and advances is that it's much more inclusive. It's sort of every part, I don't like this phrase, but I'll use it for want of anything else, but every part of the ecosystem is welcome to be a part of the IAB. And I think when we started out, we didn't include clients and agencies and lots of the support companies. It was a little bit more focused in its composition. And I think that opening it up has been very, very positive over these years. I think the vast breadth of services that the IAB provides to its members, I mean, it's almost breathtaking that, a handful of people can provide these services. I mean, this is a great example. This conversation, I hope, is helpful to people in the industry. That saying, we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. I mean, understanding history, I think, is important always to understand, again, the context in which you're working. So I think the quality, as well as the breadth of content and services that you provide to the membership, I mean, that has accelerated in its pace and in its overall offering. So I would say those are the two things that I would say are really, really different about the IAB and represent wonderful growth.
And look forward. Give us advice. 25 years from now, I don't think, maybe there will still be an IAB there, but it certainly won't be the three of us, or maybe, who knows, but it'll be an avatar. But what do you think we ought to be focusing on for the next 25 years? And then, Rich, again, I am going to go to you with these same questions.
Yes, I think that it's really the responsibility of the IAB to present balanced thinking and opportunities. I do believe that the IAB has a responsibility to be direct and to be forward and forthcoming about the issues that we face. And that has to be part of the IAB's mission, is to continually educate its membership as well as the larger community of advertising, marketing, and media. I think that's an important responsibility. And the issues that we're facing today in our digital world, they're really, really significant. And, the issues of privacy, which, boom, I was at DoubleClick, so that's a 25-year-old problem. And I think that it couldn't be more devastating, and we've seen that certainly in our national politics. It is really important that we solve this privacy issue, and I think the crumbling of cookies is part of the way. But I very often feel that some of the leaders in our industry are not taking ownership of this problem. And I feel like we're so often on the defensive instead of taking hold of the issue, admitting what the issues are, and providing solutions. And I mean that individually as companies and collectively as a community. If we don't pay closer attention to this now, we are going to find ourselves a quite regulated industry, and that is going to hurt us, in my opinion. So I think that's an example of an issue where the IAB needs to educate and, when necessary, take a strong stance on issues like that. The lack of trust is only increasing, and that's very, very bothersome. Lack of trust by individuals and also by government. They really don't like us, and that's a problem. So I think, as we look forward, whatever those issues are, and new ones will surface as well, I think we all need to be involved in providing solutions that keep the industry healthy for the long run.
Rich, why don't you bring us home? What's your last words or last questions, and we'll move on.
Well, to add to what Wenda was saying about how the IAB has changed since 2007, 2008, I think there's a few things in addition to the big tent and some of the other things that Wenda talked about. I think thought leadership has been a really important part of the kind of the DNA of the IAB, and Randy Rothenberg has done a phenomenal job of kind of bringing that home. I think the second thing is the tech standards. We've always been an organization about standards, and with the tech lab and actually grounding the industry in the kind of technology that keeps the trains running and will get us going to the future. That's a very important part of what we do. And a third piece, which has really come home, and as Wenda was talking about, it's become even more important, is our lobbying efforts in Washington to not only have a voice into the regulatory discourse, but also to take what's going on in Washington and telling our members what it means for them. Because it's not just about Washington. As we all know, it's happening in states all around the country. So those are some defining things I think the IAB has done versus back then. And then I think the other thing, looking forward for the next 25 years, is for the IAB to really be that force that inserts the consumer back into the industry. Because I think in some ways we overcorrected around technology and saw what was possible, and we didn't always keep the consumer in the center. And a lot of us that come from traditional media and marketing know that the consumer is always at the center of everything that we do. So we've got to find the intersection of privacy, safeguards, regulations, and consumer benefits, because we had this implicit understanding of the value exchange of free content for your attention. And now we need to elevate that and think about other benefits for the consumer. And there's lots of different things where that could go. And we talked about that in the last IAB there. So I think the IAB can do a lot to insert the consumer back into the discourse and keep us focused on the prize, which is helping consumers.
Yeah, I've recently been thinking that maybe if we stop calling them consumers and start thinking about them as citizens or something else, that might be a helpful way. Because is it a value exchange or is it a data tax? Anyway, I'm just as you know, I'm interested in the power of words. Let me end with something that I want to just thank both of you. In my youth, I did some work for the Rotary Club, and their slogan is service above self. Service above self. Both of you have given extraordinary service to the industry. Both of you were winners of the AdTech Industry Achievement Awards because of that service, an award that no longer exists, but was very dear to my heart back in the time. So I just want to end by thanking you, and thank you for joining us today as we, on our 25th anniversary, are trying to make sense of it all and also look forward. So Wenda Harris-Millard, Rich Lafergie, thank you so much for joining us on IAB There. I'm going to have you magically disappear from the stream and go to the credits. IAB There is a production of the Interactive Advertising Bureau. Our show today was produced by Connor Healy, Joe Pilla, and Loretta Bain. I'm Brad Behrens, editor-in-chief here at the IAB. Thank you so much for joining us. We will continue this series throughout the year, and we have many other episodes on many other topics. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everybody.